You shall not pass. Oh shit. This is the wrong story. Alright, with The Lord of the Rings on Amazon Prime coming fairly soon, about a year and a half or so, maybe a little longer, Gandalf is certainly one of the most recognizable and notable characters in Lord of the Rings. But who was Gandalf the Grey, who would later become Gandalf the White? Or better yet, what was he? So let's talk about the wizards of Middle-earth. Gandalf the Grey, servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor, and would later be known as Gandalf the White after his so-called death, is known to most of us as a wizard, but that's only how he presented himself to the people of Middle-earth. In Valinor, or the Undying Lands, to the west of Middle-earth, which is a continent reserved for the immortals, he was called Aloran. Gandalf himself says, and I quote, "Many are my names in many countries, Mithrandir among the elves, Tharkun to the dwarves, Oloran I was in my youth, in the west that is forgotten, in the south Incanus, in the north Gandalf, to the east I go not." So Gandalf went by quite a few names, but he certainly is one of the most influential characters, specifically in the Third Age when the Lord of the Rings takes place. He helped the dwarves deal with Smaug, he helped to form the Fellowship of the Ring, and of course he led the Free Peoples to the final campaign to distract Sauron, so that Frodo could finish the mission to destroy the One Ring once and for all. Gandalf was one of the Maiar, and was not a mortal man, but an angelic being who had taken a human form. As one of these angels, Aloran was in service to the one god, Eru Ilúvatar, and his so-called secret fire. He belonged to a subcategory of the Maiar called the Astari, who entered the world as one of the 5 wizards. He took on the specific form of an aged old man as a sign of his humility. The role of the wizards was to advise and counsel the leaders of Middle-earth in an attempt to beat the Dark Lord Sauron. Hopefully the kings and lords of Middle-earth would be more receptive to the advice of a humble old man than a more glorious form giving them direct commands. So the typical image of a wizard was just an attempt to look more humble so that those in Middle-earth would be more likely to take his counsel. The Astari arrived in Middle-earth around the year 1000 of the Third Age, and Gandalf was the last to arrive, landing in the havens of Mithland. He seemed the oldest and least in stature of the wizards, but Cirdan the Shipwright, one of the oldest and wisest of the immortal elves, felt that Gandalf had the highest inner greatness on their first meeting in the havens, and thus gave him the ring Nowё, the Ring of Fire. This was one of the 3 elven rings of power created after Sauron, disguised as the Lord of Gifts, showed the elves the art of ring crafting. Saruman, the chief wizard, later learned of the gift and then resented it. Until he left with the other ring bearers at the end of the Third Age, it was not known that he, and not Cirdan, was the holder of one of the 3 elven rings. Gandalf was first described in The Hobbit itself, more so about his legendary tales and adventures wherever he traveled, and then Bilbo finally described him as an old man with a staff that had a tall pointed hat along with a gray cloak and a white beard. During The Hobbit, Gandalf's primary role was inviting the 13 dwarves to the Shire and thus arranging the traveling group that is central to Bilbo's adventure and of course the novel's narrative. Gandalf, however, leaves the company before they enter Mirkwood, saying that he had pressing business to attend to, and at the time it was not known why Gandalf left the group. However, Gandalf does turn up again before the walls of Erebor disguised as an old man, revealing himself when it seems that the men of Esgaroth and the Mirkwood elves will fight Thorin and the dwarves over Smaug's treasure. The Battle of the 5 Armies ensues when hosts of goblins and wargs attacked all 3 parties, hence the name the Battle of the 5 Armies. After the battle, Gandalf accompanies Bilbo back to the Shire, revealing at Rivendell what his pressing business had been. Gandalf had once again urged the council to evict Sauron, since evidently Sauron did not require the One Ring to continue to attract evil to Mirkwood. Then, in an event only briefly described, in the Silmarillion, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings, the council, quote-unquote, put forth its power and drives Sauron from Dol Guldur. Sauron, however, has anticipated this move and withdraws only as a feint, only to reappear in Mordor. This, of course, led to the story of The Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf spends the years between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, traveling Middle-earth in search of information on Sauron's resurgence and Bilbo Baggins' mysterious ring, spurred particularly by Bilbo's initial misleading story of how he had obtained the ring as a present from Gollum, otherwise known as Smeagol. During this period, he befriends Aragorn and first becomes suspicious of Saruman. He spends as much time as he can in the Shire, strengthening his friendship with Bilbo and Frodo, Bilbo's orphaned cousin and adopted heir. His suspicions are later confirmed about Bilbo's ring, and he sets in motion what will become the quest for Frodo to destroy the One Ring once and for all. Of course, during this adventure, Gandalf dies, stopping the Balrog, also an angelic being that turned to the darkness.
You shall not
Peace! But of course, being essentially an angel, he is sent back as Gandalf the White. The Lord of Eagles carries him to Lothlorien, an elven realm where he is healed of his injuries and reclothed in white robes by Galadriel. He then travels to the Fangorn Forest where he encounters Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas, and of course, like all good stories, he gets the band back together. Aragorn and Gandalf then lead the final campaign against Sauron's forces at the Black Gate in an effort to distract the Dark Lord's attention from Frodo and Sam, who are at the moment scaling Mount Doom to destroy the One Ring. In a parley before the battle, Gandalf and the other leaders of the West meet Sauron's chief lieutenant, the Mouth of Sauron, who shows them Frodo's mithril shirt and other items from the Hobbit's equipment, where he had apparently been captured. Gandalf, however, rejects Mordor's terms of surrender, and the forces of the West face the full might of Sauron's armies until the One Ring is finally destroyed in Mount Doom. Gandalf then leads the Eagles to rescue Frodo and Sam from the erupting mountain. After the war, Gandalf crowns Aragorn as king, he accompanies the hobbits back to the borders of the Shire, and then 2 years later, Gandalf departs Middle-earth forever. He boards the Ring-Bearer's ship in the Grey Havens and sets sail to return across the sea to the Undying Lands, and with him are his friends Frodo, Bilbo, Galadriel, Elrond, and of course his horse Shadowfax. So be sure to click right over here for another Lord of the Rings video, or click right over here for a video essay on why fantasy is important to pop culture. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.